Recorders on. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Polish Jazz Festival in Tel Aviv, second week. My name is Barak Weiss. I'm one of the artistic directors of the festival, and I'm thrilled and honored to have with us a wonderful musician, a wonderful trumpet player, a very good, so I've been told, a jazz educator directly from Poland, Mr. Piotr Schmidt. Piotr's gonna introduce us briefly to the amazing history of jazz in Poland. And without further ado, I'd like Piotr to start his lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Barak. Hello, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you. What I would like to do, because I teach history of jazz like 10 years already, and we are focusing mostly on American jazz during the lectures. But this Polish jazz is a topic that is very close to me, mostly because of my father, who's 98 right now. So he was born in 1922, and he was a jazz historian mostly, but during late 1940s, so after the war, he had his two quite significant in Silesia region jazz bands. Of course, jazz dance bands, because still in 1940s it was mostly jazz dance bands existed, right? So modern jazz started in Poland in late 1950s. Because of him, I became a trumpet player. Because of him, I started to teach history of jazz and be interested in history of jazz and history of Polish jazz as well. Right now, right here, I would like to focus mostly on the far, history, mainly interwar period, so between 1920s, 1930s, and during the war period, so 1940s. This is the most interesting because no one knows anything about that usually, basically, this is a lot of times omitted area of Polish jazz. Of course, some people believe it should be omitted because the amount of jazz in the dance bands, dance orchestras wasn't really high, wasn't really big. So basically, there is nothing to talk about. But I believe it's a little bit different story, and I have a different opinion about that. So I would like to start from the basically very beginning of Polish jazz history. And because all of jazz came from America, so this, of course, is crucial to understanding why jazz in Europe looked differently, for example, in Britain, in France, in Germany after First World War, or in Poland. So I would like to start from mentioning that the British and the French basically had the earliest opportunity to experience jazz between the two world wars. The British especially had full exposure to American culture. Americans traveled and performed in Britain throughout the 19th century. Even the Germans had greater exposure to jazz than the Poles because of their contacts with Britain and also occasional visits by American bands. Poland was simply too far away. Naturally, jazz was dance music right up to the end of the 1940s. For example, Foxtrot conquered Berlin as early as the winter of 1918, so still the end of the First World War. Right from the start, jazz attracted controversy. Some saw in this conductor-free music a paradigm of democracy. Others saw communism, Americanism, or barbarity. Racist and nationalist analogies appeared. German reactionaries saw in jazz the completion of German defeat to satisfy the older generation of salon and beer garden musicians. The magazine Artist proclaimed jazz just another dance whim. The German Kapellmeisters union thought the same. Anyway, it was evolving, and the drum kit became synonymous with jazz, and the drummer became the most important person in the band. The drummer should know how to sing, dance, juggle, and drum on pot lids, washboards, cowbells, whistlers, car horns, rattles, buzzers, sirens, pistols, loudspeakers. The list is endless. So starting from some significant events in 1921, the young Sigmund Karashinsky, I will talk about these names a little bit later. So Sigmund Karashinsky visits Berlin and encounters the jazz craze. Karashinsky was a Warsaw conservatoire educated pianist and violinist, and son of a famous composer of waltzes. He begins to play cinemas in duet with his school friend Szymon Karashinsky, improvising soundtracks to silent films. Eventually, he attracted the attention of Harry Spiller, leader of an American Dixieland band, who employed him and helped him learn to play the saxophone. He was a natural improviser. In 1922, he and Spiller played at the opening of the first dance hall in the spa town of Sopot, then part of the free city of Gdańsk, which belonged neither to Poland nor to Germany. Karashinsky's next step up was natural, from Sopot to Gdańsk, where the new club Hermitage encouraged him to form his own band. He played the violin and alto saxophone and was joined by Jerzy Petersburski on the piano, and Fred Melodist on banjo, and two German musicians on double bass and drums. These names are very important. I will mention them later again, so you'll know them. Basically, it was Poland's first jazz band. And with this band, Karashinsky played at the opening of Warsaw's dance hall Oaza in 1923. His old friend Szymon Karashinsky was on the piano, Kazimierz Engelhardt on trombone, Imre Bart from Hungary on banjo and guitar, and a mixed race drummer, step dancer and singer Sam Salvano as well, mostly on drums. Their repertoire included such American standards as Dina or Tiger Rug, so all what we know. Aside from Spiller, Poland basically lacked contact with American jazz. Meanwhile, 1920s Britain seethed with jazz, with a steady supply of fresh American talent, who also visited Britain's nearest neighbors. Together with other countries, Poland was rich in anti-jazz rhetoric at the time. The famous writer Kornel Makuszyński compared jazz to the biblical deluge, called it a stupid monster and a savage Negro weed. He lamented that nobody will bother to listen to Chopin anymore or salon songs because their ears would be already destroyed by the noise of jazz. Such attitudes did not help popularize jazz in Poland, but they didn't handicap it much either. The desire to dance it unleashed in people was unstoppable. All of this didn't worry Karashinsky and Kataszek. They were popular, made money, and led what in the future would be called rock and roll lives. They played in cabarets, theaters, cinemas, and were frequently engaged in advertising campaigns. In Warsaw's Oaza Club, Jerzy Petersburski continued performing in the Gold and Petersburski Orchestra with Artur Gold. They were both Polish Jews and were in fact related, since 1925 Artur also performed with his brother Henryk Gold in an 8-piece combo playing the Bodega Cafe in Warsaw and recording for the Syrena studio. However, Artur Gold's collaboration with Petersburski brought him greater popularity. By the late 20s, jazz in Poland was still handicapped, even compared to Germany. But Germany continued to attract American musicians, which helped popularize and develop German jazz. Arthur Briggs, Sidney Bechet, Paul Whiteman with his symphonic jazz all visited Germany, as did Sam Wooding's band, which at Berlin's Admiral Palast performed jazz versions of traditional German songs. Between 1925 and 1929, 1.5 million gramophones were sold in Germany. More and more bands transformed themselves into jazz bands. All it took was to add the word jazz to the band's name and adapt their repertoire and instrumentation. Over time, such bands also jazzed up their style to actually become jazz bands. It is possible that Sam Wooding's orchestra visited also Poland, and maybe even twice, during its 1925-1926 European tour with the Chocolate Kiddies review, which featured the famous trumpeter Tommy Ladner. The orchestra probably gave in Poland 2 concerts on its way from Berlin to Moscow. In 1926, Sidney Bechet's Jazz Kings spent several months in the Soviet Union playing theaters and dance halls in Moscow, Kharkov, Odessa, and Kiev. American jazz musicians were probably more often in Soviet Union than in Poland during this time. Going forward, the first Polish radio station began trial broadcasting in February 1925. There were also printing programs every 2 weeks. This is why we know that from the very beginning they were playing jazz. Warsaw's radio was no exception. The radio waves were full of stations from various countries, all transmitting, among other genres, obviously, jazz. Officially, Polish radio came on air on April 1926. The fortnightly magazine Radiophon Polski, Radiofon Polski, tells of jazz concert transmissions from Rome, Barcelona, Munich, Zurich, Milan, and so on. Of course, Polish radio listeners were highly divided. Some demanded more Strauss, waltzes, and operettas, and Polish folk music. Others wanted more jazz and better information about what is being played. Radio had a key role for Polish bands playing American dance music. On one hand, it played new Polish albums recorded at Polish studios Syrena and Odeon, and transmitted live performances. On the other hand, it exposed the growing number of Poles with radio receivers to music from abroad, and so enabled people to compare local and international music. Because we are right now talking about quite a lot of Polish names, I would like to switch screens, for example, and share a screen with you right now, so you don't see me for a second, just for a couple of minutes, and you see picture show of some Polish people who I already mentioned, and I will mention more, and I will mention, of course, about some other more as well, who you can see on the pictures. So if you let me share the screen, which is, yes, I think here. Okay, you see it? Okay, can you see this slideshow? Probably yes. Okay, so I will continue, and you can look at these pictures for now. So Serena Records was the largest record company of interwar Poland. It was established in 1906 by Juliusz Feigenbaum, a Warsaw merchant and industrialist of Jewish origin. In 1923, the company issued its first post-war catalog. In 1929, they introduced electric recording technology and changed its name to Serena Electro. Just to remind you, Americans changed this recording technology into electric 3 years earlier in 1926. So we in Europe were like 3 years after Americans in this case. Well, it's Serena Electro Records. Its last catalog was published in summer of 1939. Of course, the invading Germans closed the company down for good. After the radio, another technological milestone which helped root jazz in Poland was the sound revolution in cinema. The first film with sound, the 1927 Jazz Singer, reached Polish screens and speakers 2 years later. The film's premiere was greeted by musicians and some film critics with countless protests against the new technology. After all, thousands of musicians made a living by playing live accompaniment to silent films. Still, film music was full of jazz at that time. The year 1927 saw also the first edition of Jazz magazine in Poland. Unfortunately, the next edition had to await publication until 1956. So it was just the only one in 1927. There was also a huge event in Poznań in 1929, an event of national, cultural, and economic importance to interwar Poland, the Polish General Exhibition, marking the 10th anniversary of Poland's independence. Interestingly, the organizers invited almost exclusively jazz bands, including the Stefan Jochens trio, Fred Melodist, Karashinsky and Catacomb, and many more. Even more interestingly, the music wasn't to be danced to, but listened to. Well, a sign of going up in the world. So by the end of the 1920s, there was a couple of bands which could be called pioneers of Polish jazz. So the Karashinsky and Catacomb Orchestra, the Artur Gold and Jerzy Petersburski Jazz Band, the Fred Melodist Band, Henryk Gold's Oaza Jazz, Zygmunt Wichler's Dance Orchestra, Henryk War's Dance Orchestra. So, if I mentioned Henryk Wars, he is a very important person. He was born as Henryk Warszawski, actually, but changed his last name to Wars. He was a popular composer, arranger, pianist, and conductor, born in 1902 in a Jewish family. He was an important feature of the interwar show business world in Poland. He wrote for films, wrote and performed at revue theaters and cabarets. From 1928, he was the music director of the Syrena record company. Some of his hits remain familiar to Polish audiences to this day, much like the classic American jazz standards. These include Już taki jestem, zimny drań, or umówiłem się z nią na 9:00, or ach, jak przyjemnie kołysać się wśród fal, gdy szumi woda. So after, sorry for this singing, after World War II, he settled in Los Angeles and worked in Hollywood very, very successfully. So Henrik Vars. Well, to summarize 1920s, jazz in Poland was dominated by the dance floor, and in particular by dances such as shimmy, foxtrot, charleston, black bottom, one step, two step, and other ragtime derivatives. A huge economic crisis started the 1930s, both in America and in Europe. However, the demand for entertainment continued to grow. Records continued being recorded, sheet music continued to sell, Polish radio continued to transmit live from dance halls, and American artists continued to skip Poland on their tours. So the source of information about jazz was mainly American cinema, which often presented a skewed racist image of jazz, ignoring black artists and overplaying white artists, as in the famous 1930 film about Paul Whiteman, showing him as the inventor and king of jazz. Alongside the old guard of jazz bands, new kids appeared on the block, often coming from military and school orchestras. The Ministry of the Military looked after the cultural life of the army and kept a lot of orchestras in the units. Many secondary schools also had wind bands. The most famous example of these was a band called Szał, Craze. Their shows at the Bristol Hotel in Lwów met with a craze indeed. After a few years, they made enough money to buy their own club in Krakow called Cyganeria, where they performed and where they also invited other groups to perform. Some excellent musicians played with Szał, including alto saxophonist Leonard Lowka-Ilgowski, which I will mention soon again. Silesia, a region now in southwestern Poland, was another important center of jazz bands. One such band, led by a trumpeter by the name of Potok, was called the Melody Maker. That's where Albert Pradella started his career. After World War II, he went on to play at the Polish radio's Orchestra. He remembered that jazz was mainly played in the early hours of the morning, after the official program finished and violinists and accordionists went home. Then jazz musicians could jam. In 1930s, dance band considered to be the jazziest was called Wileńczycy, meaning people from Vilno or Vilnius, the city which is now the capital of Lithuania, but between the wars was within Polish borders. Its leader was the Saxon clarinet player Leonard Ilgowski, I mentioned before. He was a Vilnius Pole who modeled his playing on Benny Goodman and moved to Warsaw in the mid-20s. He headed the band until 1935, when he returned to Vilnius to become the director of the Vilno Polish Radio's Orchestra. Meanwhile, Syrena Records imported from the USA 30 master discs with recordings by such greats as Red Nichols, Fletcher Henderson, or Benny Goodman, and issued them locally. This was a huge injection of understanding of jazz for the Polish audience, who could now buy jazz records across the entire country. As we are going towards World War II, it is important to note that by the end of the 1920s, there grew hostility in some parts of German society against anything that's non-German. Jazz was one of these sentiments' victims. The gradually radicalizing Nazis talked of jazz rot, its wickedness, and how it lacked soul, depth, and content. By 1926, they started attacking the American dancer and singer performing in France, Josephine Baker, and her show, the Revue Nègre, as a Jew-infested Negro show. The saxophone was mocked as the black's pipe, and the use of muted trumpets was believed to release the worst instincts in people. These attacks and bans didn't really hurt the perception of jazz in Germany at large. This was mainly because of swing, which brought great popularity of white musicians such as Goodman, Glenn Miller, or Tommy Dorsey, and whose big bands largely played from sheet music, something that was seen as European. Swing era brought an end to the earlier hot jazz and its hot improvisations associated with Black Americans. Swing's popularity was the biggest in Germany during the 1936 Berlin Olympics, when the Nazis, trying to prove how open to the world they are, invited countless swing bands from Germany and from abroad to play. This policy was reversed just a year later. Jazz could no longer be played officially. Now it was played in camouflage, for example, by translating hit titles into German. And so Tiger Rock became Schwarzer Panther, and the Jewish in origin song Joseph Joseph was renamed Sie will nicht Blumen und nicht Schokolade. St. Louis Blues was renamed Sauerkraut. Okay, I think it will be enough of this share screen video. How to put it back? I don't know. Okay, I don't know how to. Oh yeah, stop share screen. Perfect, it's here. So you can see me. You know, I prefer actually that you see me instead of all those pictures because of my facial expressions and mimics that will help to understand what I'm talking and what I'm saying. So it will be helpful. But I also wanted you to see these pictures because of these people we already talked, and we will a little bit talk more in a second. Someone asked, no audio samples. The audio samples Barak Weiss will send you after the lecture. So you will have something to listen to after the lecture that I chose for you. Okay, let's get back to the lecture. Sauerkraut, sie will nicht Blumen und nicht Schokolade. Yeah, that kind of camouflage. After Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party came to power in 1933, artists started fleeing Germany, especially those of Jewish origin. One of them was Adi Rosner, a trumpeter born in Berlin, whose father came from the Polish city of Łódź. Adi, whose actually full name was Adolf, but it couldn't help him actually. He changed this Adolf name into Adi or Eddie, differently spelled. So Adi decided to escape persecution by settling in Poland, first having tried Belgium and Denmark. The arrival of such talented musicians sent beneficial shockwaves through Polish jazz. Adi Rosna supposedly visited the USA in 1931, where he met Whiteman, Goodman, and Armstrong. Apparently, also in 1934 in Brussels, he participated in a trumpeter's jam session contest. He came second, and the winner was Louis Armstrong himself. So from that moment, Rosna was called the White Armstrong and came to Poland already famous. When he set up his orchestra, it included many immigrants like himself, aside from native Polish musicians. With it, he toured Poland and occasionally other countries up till September 1939, when his flat in Warsaw was bombed. He survived by hiding under a ground piano. Well, after this, decided to escape farther east. When he traveled through the northeastern city of Bialystok, which after the Russian invasion became part of the Soviet Belarus, the first secretary of the local Communist Party heard him play and made his orchestra the National Jazz Orchestra of the Belarusian Soviet Republic. This led to Rosna playing for Joseph Stalin himself, who supposedly liked him very much. Adi Rosna's orchestra became known as Stalin's band and toured around the Soviet Union by traveling on their own train. Rosna made good money and lived elegantly in the Kremlin area of Moscow. After the war, however, the atmosphere changed against jazz in the Soviet Union as the imperialist American music, and Rosner was arrested in 1946. Upon his release from Gulag in 1954, he formed a 64-person band in Moscow. 3 years before his death, he was allowed to return to Berlin. He died in 1976. So Adi Rosner was a very important figure in Polish and Soviet Union's jazz scene, coming basically from Berlin, but of Polish Jewish origins. Another band from the late 30s that's worth mentioning is Franciszek Witkowski's orchestra. Adi Rosner praised them for great precision of performance. Their first major success came playing on the transatlantic ship during a voyage to the USA. In 1939, Witkowski and his band traveled again to the States and as the Polish representatives at the New York's World Expo. And that's where they were when World War II broke out. Soon after Hitler gained power, in 1933, a young Polish-Jewish composer, Bronisław Kaper, decided to emigrate via Germany and France to the USA, where he went on to be a huge success, also in jazz. His standards, The Green Dolphin Street and Invitation, are performed to this day, and I believe all of you, if you love jazz, heard these standards many times. So, well, however, few people were as clairvoyant as Kaper. German Jewish musicians, after often chose to make Poland their home in the wake of Nazi rule, hoping for a peaceful life and musical career. Polish Jewish musicians didn't think much of emigrating either. Polish media and the government were convincing the nation that Poland was a great military power. You know, people believed in this also because of the 1920 Battle of Warsaw, won by Poles against the overwhelming Bolshevik forces. So because of all of this, Polish Jews felt safe in Poland. However, after the invasion of Poland in September 1939, many musicians of Jewish origin decided to run away eastwards. At first, their targets were the cities of Vilno and Lvov, already invaded by the Soviets, who, for the time being, were friendly enough towards Jewish people. In this early phase of the war, Poles and Polish Jews were able to keep alive cultural life, tolerated and occasionally even supported by the Soviet invaders. In early September, Sigmund Karashinsky fled to Bialystok, where, with the blessing of the Soviet authorities, just like Adi Rozna, he formed a short-lived band called Belarusian Jazz. Later, he moved to Lvov and formed a band called Jazz Revia, Jazz Review. Next, he traveled to Poland's Alpine Tatra Mountains, where he remained in hiding for the rest of the war. Jerzy Petersburski's trajectory was similar. First, he performed at Bialystok's Puppet Theater, and next he moved to Lvov and played with Henryk Wars and Henryk Gold's orchestras. Henryk Wars took part in the Polish military's ill-fated defense and became a prisoner of war. However, he managed to escape and once in Lvov, set up a band in 1940. With it, he traveled to many Soviet cities, giving hundreds of concerts, presumably with a little degree of jazz. Henryk Gold established a symphonic jazz band and also toured the Soviet Union with it, sometimes gathering audiences as large as 35,000 listeners. Quite impressive. The talented composer and librettist Felix Konarski, known as Refren. Refren is actually like a chorus, like a bridge in a tune. So Felix Konarski, known as Refren, led during the war his own band in Lvov. His guitarist was the later popular singer Zbigniew Kurtycz. In an interview, Kurtycz remembered that their repertoire was approaching jazz and that they frequently performed in the Soviet Union. At the beginning of war, jazz musicians from Poland enjoyed often support by the occupying forces, especially Soviet Union forces, like Adi Rozner's protector, the Belarusian Communist Party's secretary Ponomarenko, who incidentally later gave the order to exterminate Polish soldiers from the AK partisan army. Well, however, there was no greater fan of jazz than the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. He sponsored an outstanding jazz orchestra which operated in Berlin throughout the war, even when jazz was completely forbidden in the Third Reich after 1941. Well, he loved jazz. Vilno in 1940 was a pretty safe place for both Poles and Jews and became the uncrowded capital of Polish theater, hosting such talents as Hanka Bielicka, Danuta Szaflarska, Hanka Ordonówna, or Ludwik Sempoliński, big names of theater. Ludwik Sempoliński's song called That Mustache, ooh, that mustache, was a particularly popular satire of Hitler. Jazz also blossomed in Vilno with bands such as the Pocket Jazz Orchestra with Henryk Czyż on alto saxophone and Michał Niemira on drums. In February 1941, at Vilno's Polish Theater, the Vilno Jazz Orchestra had its debut. It was led by the pianist Tadeusz Milstein. He refused to transform the band into a National Soviet ensemble, and just 4 months after the debut in June 1941, he was sent to a labor camp in Siberia. The greatest jazz musicians among those who settled in Vilno was the already mentioned clarinetist and saxophonist Leonard Lowka Ilgowski. He played at Vilno's cafe U Dormana, which was visited mainly by the Polish diaspora. It was there that he was heard, as he played Goodman, Ellington, or Glenn Miller, by the next generation of Polish jazz popularizers like Leopold Thurman and Franciszek Walicki. Actually, if you can see what's behind me, there are two books. The one is Leopold Thurman, U brzegów jazzu. I will mention this book later. This is a biography of Leopold Thurman. I just wanted to have some nice, nice background behind me. Mr. Krzysztof Komeda, Tomasz Stańko, and a wonderful book, A Story of Polish Jazz by Krystian Brodacki. And this one is my father's book, History of Jazz. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam. Yeah. So Leopold Thurman. Well, Thurman wasn't a musician, but became after the war an influential writer, journalist, and promoter of jazz, and the organizer of communist Poland's first jazz concerts and festivals in the late 50s in Sopot and Warsaw. Back in 1938 and 1939, he studied architecture in Paris. In September 1939, he had to run for his life from Warsaw because of his Jewish ancestry. And Thurman spent the first 2 years of the war in Vilna. Then made it to Germany, where he worked as a waiter for 2 years, pretending to be French. He learned French very well when he was studying architecture in Paris. Well, Leopold Thurman was incredibly talented, a person as well for languages. So after all, after many years, he knew like 7 languages very, very well. Anyway, among the musicians who settled in Lviv, many of these, after the German invasion in 1941, migrated farther east. Almost all of them joined General Anders' Polish armed forces in the east. Felix Konarski, again known as Refren, I mentioned him before, played in Moscow with his orchestra when the Germans invaded. To survive, the musicians turned south to Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan, where they often played in exchange for food. They too joined the Anders army and transformed their orchestra into a new army band. Henryk Wars, Jerzy Petersburski, and Fred Melodist joined forces under Anders and created the army's official trio, playing during official ceremonies of the army. Petersburski and Schutz created a piano duet in Brazil. Later, Petersburski moved to Argentina, where he headed Teatro Nacional in Buenos Aires. He's remembered as the composer of such hits as Wszystkie drogi prowadzą do Buenos Aires, All roads lead to Buenos Aires, as well as Tango Milonga and Ta ostatnia niedziela. These last two are tangos he wrote before the war, so clearly the war took him to where his musical passions lay. Well, let's go more to the west of the World War II period. In the German-occupied Polish western lands, called the General Governorate, the cultural life was concentrated mainly in the two cities of Krakow and Warsaw. Warsaw especially was a nest of the Aryan elites of Polish theater, film and music, and the Nazis started terror directly after the capitulation of the Polish army. Even so, some effort was made to make certain elements of culture accessible to Poles and also to Jews locked in ghettos. These elements were carefully selected, politically neutral, and intended to stupefy, to stop people from thinking also about fight and resistance. So the German-controlled theaters were full of revues, comedies, and other cheerful content. Musicians obviously accompanied these theatrical productions. Aside from the openly collaborationist venues, there were also smaller art cafes run by artists simply trying to survive. Barbara Kostrzewska and Mieczysław Fok, or the famous choir Dana, sung in such venues. At Cafe Aria, the superlative duo Witold Lutosławski and Andrzej Panównik performed their own arrangements of Bach, Paganini, Stravinsky, and other classical composers, as well as jazz-related improvisations for over 3 years in this Cafe Aria. Stasiak's jazz orchestra played at Warsaw's German Cafe Club. Stasiak himself later ended up in Auschwitz, where he played in a 40-person prisoner orchestra. They performed for prisoners and the Nazis alike. Their repertoire would have consisted of popular German songs, but it may have been jazzing them up a little bit. Camp orchestras were a special German invention. Their aim was to create a sense that the camps are livable places to be. Their extreme example was the ghetto swingers from Theresienstadt camp near Prague. This direct imitation of an American big band aimed to create a jolly atmosphere. It was anything but. Out of 300,000 inmates, only 20,000 survived. In October 1941, Warsaw's Theatre Momus started a cycle of Sunday morning performances. Their stars were the trumpet George Scott's Jazz Orchestra, remembered from performing in Warsaw before the war. The German authorities publicized the events with the leader's photo and the promotional text. George Scott also performed in Cafe Bodega and was considered Warsaw's king of jazz during the Nazi occupation. The Warsaw Ghetto also had its music and theater venues. At Cafe Nowoczesna, Arthur Gold performed with an orchestra he put together in the ghetto. After his internment at the concentration camp in Treblinka in 1942, he played there at the German camp club Casino. He was murdered in 1943. When Germans entered Lwów, Szymon Kataszek returned to Warsaw and soon ended up in the ghetto, where he headed a 30-person orchestra. He was shot in the Pawek prison in May 1943. In 1942, Germans brought to Warsaw the famous Czech jazz saxophonist Charles Bovary. The band, he was really famous, also played a lot in Poland after the war. The band played mainly in Warsaw's Germans, for Warsaw's Germans, but they also performed after a while for the general Polish population. When we look at Krakow, the Krakow-based head of the general governorate, Hans Frank, ordered the creation of the General Governorate Philharmonic. Classical concerts with German conductors but Polish musicians were performed in the former auditorium of Świt Cinema. Jazz musicians were also active in Krakow, and among them Kazimierz Turewicz and orchestra trumpeter Zbigniew Wróbel, Władysław Kowalczyk, drummer Marian Puc, and saxophonist Stanisław Świderek. Mainly they performed in 2 nightclubs in Krakow, Casanova and Phoenix, but Turewicz also toured outside Krakow. It all came to a halt, but not quite end, in late August 1944, when the Third Reich announced total war effort. Theaters were closed, schools of acting, music and dance were closed, orchestras and bands suspended all activity, all culture and education was stopped, even within the military. There was exceptions, however. Hans Frank didn't allow the closure of his baby, the General Governorate Philharmonic, and many small venues like cafes remained open. So artistic activity, included jazz, somehow made it till the end of the war. Leopold Thurman, in his book U brzegów jazzu, On the Shores of Jazz, remembers a conversation with a young German listening to Benny Goodman. So there was a German who was listening to Benny Goodman, and he said to the German after a while of conversation, just think about it. Here you're listening to a Jewish American, a Black American, and a Polish American, or maybe Czech. What do you think of that? And the German blushed and responded, back off with this nonsense. You think I care because I am German? That's rubbish. Man, just listen to the music, how they play. That's something else. So I think that says everything about the regular people who are not very, who don't always listen to their to authorities and rulers. Anyway, shortly after the liberation of Poland by its former Soviet occupants, the secret police and KWD terror started. At the same time, the communist authorities continued the old Bolshevik strategy of causing up the Polish people, deluding them with patriotic slogans, assurances of democratic and religious freedoms, and of supporting the arts. Artists were granted good conditions and given hope of a good future, so long as they support the new regime. The Young People's Republic was still finding its totalitarian feet, and between 1945 and 1949, people were confused enough to go about their business as usual. So private companies grew, shops, small factories, young people wanted places to dance in. The Iron Curtain hadn't descended yet, but Poland felt its isolation from the West. There was no way of and no money for inviting American or even Western European jazz bands. No record market, no normal information flow in the press, in books and sheet music. Not a single American jazz band visited Poland in these years. Meanwhile, Western Europe was literally flooded with the greatest jazz stars and their records. Lwów and Wilno were no longer within the Polish borders, so the two obvious centers of cultural rebirth were Warsaw and Krakow. Already in April 1945, Krakow hosted the first post-war session of the Polish IMCA, YMCA, its youth youth Christian organization. Anyway, the reactivation of this institution in many Polish towns and cities between 1945 and 1949 was a lifesaver for jazz, because this organization imported a lot of records, sheet music, and instruments from the West. It sponsored big bands and gave them space to rehearse in. All of it was obviously closed down by the authorities in 1949. In September 1945, Kraków also hosted the first National Congress of Polish Composers and its attendant Festival of Contemporary Polish Music. In October, the first edition of the fortnightly magazine Ruch Muzyczny appeared. Its editor-in-chief was Stefan Kisielewski, writer and composer, openly sympathetic to jazz. Krakow's dance clubs were dominated by pre-war musicians, such as Kazimierz Turewicz or Zbigniew Wróbel, and by swing. Among their jazz-loving audiences were such future greats as Jerzy Duduś Matuszkiewicz or Witold Kujawski. While the jazz saxophonist Jerzy Duduś Matuszkiewicz became the key personality of early post-war jazz in Poland. Born in 1928 in Jasło, he was growing up in a musical family in Lwów. Barely 11 when the war broke out, he taught himself, listened to German dance music, and fell in love with Kazimierz Turewicz Orchestra and jazz. When after the war it became clear that Lwów would no longer belong to Poland, he repatriated along with countless others, choosing Kraków for his new home. Kraków was also Kazimierz Turewicz's orchestra's home ground. At the time, all of the venues hiring jazz bands were still privately owned. Nationalization, as well as ideological anti-jazz and anti-Western pressure, did not start seriously until 1949, 1950. Writing about jazz also flourished, both on the pages of the Ruch Muzyczny magazine and in the Leopold Thurman's essays. Thurman often explained the role of syncopation and the central concept of improvisation, the notion of swing, the origins of jazz, and so on. Soon he became the jazz oracle in Warsaw and farther afield. What buildings still stood in Warsaw were quickly filled with music. Charles Bowery's and Kazimierz Turewicz's post-war jazz bands and Jerzy Harald's and Jan Keimer's radio orchestras all shared between. Away from the main Polish metropolis, the university city of Gliwice in southwestern Poland's Silesia, newly Polish and filled with repatriants from the lost eastern cities of Lwów and Wilno, sprouted a particularly lively jazz cultural in my father's two bands. So my father, Andrzej Schmidt, this book here. So Sweet Jazz was his one band from 1945 to 1947, and Jaworski and Schmidt Septet from 1947 to 1950. So with each passing year, the political climate became more and more hostile to jazz until it had to descend underground in 1949, which with the advent of Stalinism. Already in 1946, the Soviet propaganda newspaper Pravda, meaning truth, published an article entitled Triviality on Stage, in which the author demonstrated that Adi Rosner plays tricks on his audiences and plays music which erodes the minds of its listeners. Soon a slogan appeared, "Who plays jazz today will betray the motherland tomorrow." Such attitudes reached Poland with a few years delay, furious delay, and in their wake, jazz entered the so-called Catacomb Period. Jazz could only be played in private homes, more jam sessions than concerts. The light bearers in this period included Witold Kujawski, Andrzej Kurlewicz, Jerzy Duduś-Matuszkiewicz, and from around 1952, Krzysztof Komeda, who later gained international fame as pianist, jazz and film score composer. This is over there, his biography. Why was jazz banned under Stalinism? You know, this can be some more philosophical questions, but you know, a music style that's mainly instrumental, deprived of revolutionary lyrics. Was it perhaps the freedom of the individual contained in and symbolized by the improvising musician? The improviser is free from totalitarian restrictions, and the totalitarian regime did not like that. Every regime needs an enemy. This is another thing. After the Soviet Union won World War II, there came national euphoria, and war-weary people drew a deep breath of free, fresh air. But an enemy had to be found, and so jazz ceased to be the music of the black slave, and instead became the music of American imperialists. Stalinism in Poland did not pass until 2 years after the death of Stalin, around 1955. That year, Polish and foreign jazz bands played at Warsaw's World Festival of Youth and Students. And soon after that, after the first ever All Souls Jazz Festivals, Zaduszki Jazzowe, All Souls Jazz Festival, held in Kraków and in Zabrze, came the first recordings by the jazz band Melomani, featuring the vocalist Carmen Moreno, and by the Andrzej Kurlewicz Sextet with Wanda Warska. Next, a national jazz orchestra was created called Blue Jazz, and headed by Ryszard Damrosch. Jazz journalists grew too. In February 1956, the monthly magazine Jazz was first published, expertly edited by Józef Balcerák, one of key supporters of Polish jazz. The first strictly jazz festivals came in 1956 and 1957 in Sopot. These festivals gathering up to 30,000 people revealed the Polish audiences, the first post-war heroes of Polish jazz, the Melomani band in its traditional and modern incarnations. This was actually interesting because a lot of bands had its traditional and modern incarnations, phases. So they played both traditional jazz and they tried to play modern jazz, playing sometimes this, sometimes this. So Melomani in the Sopot 1956 Jazz Festival played both traditional and modern incarnations and music. The Kurlewicz Sextet, Krzysztof Komeda's Sextet with Jan Ptaszyn-Wróblewski and Jerzy Milian, Zygmunt Wichary's band from Silesia. In 1956, the Silesian Jazz Club opened its doors, initially in Zabrze, then in Gliwice, my hometown, where it exists to this day, constantly exists to this day. This is the longest still existing club in Poland. The jazz community was becoming aware of its goals and interests. In 1957, the Jazz Club's Coordinating Committee was created. That same year saw the publication of Leopold Thurman's seminal book, On the Shores of Jazz. From 1958 onwards, Warsaw hosted its own jazz festival, the Jazz Jamboree. It was previously in Sopot. It went to Warsaw. So from 1958, it's still in Warsaw Jazz Jamboree. And Hot Club Hybrydy became an important jazz hub for many years. Late 50s and early 60s brought to the fore such bands as Andrzej Kurlewicz Trio with Wanda Warska, Jazz Believers with Andrzej Trzaskowski, Jan Ptaszyn-Wróblewski, Krzysztof Komeda, Wojciech Karolak, Jerzy Duduś-Matuszkiewicz Quartet, Krzysztof Komeda Trio, Witold Krotochwil Sextet, Andrzej Trzaskowski's The Wreckers with Zbigniew Namysłowski, Michał Urbaniak, Roman Dylong and Adam Jędrzejewski. Many, many more, of course. So the 60s completed the process of professionalization of jazz in Poland. No longer was it an amateur calling of passion, but a profession with ever-increasing mastery and artistry. The leaders in this process became obvious, and the first truly influential recordings were made, like Astigmatic of Krzysztof Komeda. The 60s made stars out of Komeda, Namysłowski, Trzaskowski, Karolak, Nahorny, Adam Makowicz, Tomasz Stańko, Janusz Muniak, and Michał Urbaniak. Free jazz, however, came from Ornette Coleman's Free Jazz 1959-1960, came to Poland as well, and was growing in popularity, perhaps also because of its political connotations. Free jazz filled student clubs as young people saw in it a protest against Moscow's supremacy, this idea of freedom in music and in politics. Well, all the same, it is important to stress that the socialist Poland took good care of its artists, so long as they didn't pick a fight with the state and its ideology, especially in 1970s and 1980s, as far as all of my older friends were telling me. Musicians and other artists played a lot, earned well, and were truly privileged class. After the fall of communism in 1989, musicians became free to express themselves politically, but at the same time became enslaved to the market forces of providing goods that would sell, especially as state subsidies to the arts were being diminished year by year. And actually this process continues. So this is basically all I would like to say. The modern times are very critical, of course, but my private impression and opinion about what happened, for example, during the World War II, comparing to right now lockdown situation from March to June, is that a lot of musicians could play in a lot of venues, in a lot of places, not always what they wanted, but they could play, they could be musicians. No one forbid them from playing, whereas in 2020, a couple of months ago, we basically were forbidden from playing. We could only do it online, no connection with the receiver, direct connection in the club or cultural venue or festival. So to me, personally, this was really, unbelievable situation that have never happened before, because World War II was full of music, of course, full of fear, full of stress, full of risk of death, and this death came very often, of course. Now this is a different situation. You will not die, but you just cannot play. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to me. And if you have any questions about anything, please go ahead right now. You need to turn on microphone if you want to say something. I cannot do it for you. Maybe Barak can do it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you, Zahar.
It was very interesting. I'm very impressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have a question. You hear me?
Yes, yes.
How many active, let's say, young jazz musicians, let's say under the age of 40, are now playing in Poland?
I cannot answer to this question. So
100?
under the age of 40, active jazz musicians right now, right?
Wow, nice.
I don't really know. I mean, a lot of musicians, because right now, this is the same as it was 100 years ago, for example. The jazz musicians that are not like in the best the best couple of I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 jazz musicians can actually live out of playing strictly only playing jazz in Poland. The other musicians need to teach as well, which is fine, which is good. But other musicians play, for example, some different kind of styles of music in different kind of concerts, or they play weddings or something like this to support their financials. So I believe altogether the musicians that could actually earn a decent living out of playing jazz and only jazz is maybe 100.
If there is by chance a portal, an internet portal, which, let's say, if I enter in and I can see or learn about CDs or music that was published in Poland, let's say in the last 5 to 10 years, it would be nice if you send us before you close that
yes.
address.
Adam Baruch is laughing because he knows that I'm a artistic director of one of the recording company in Poland. So probably it will be the first one I will send to you,
Okay.
which is
That's okay.
Which is this one. It's already on chat, sjrecords.eu. But of course, if you go to different labels, even international companies like Warner Music Poland, Sony Music Poland, Universal Music Poland, this is all these international labels that are very strong in jazz in Poland, especially Warner, because it owns this series of Polish jazz CDs. So if you go there, you can check out this series. And but you know, a lot of musicians they don't agree with their choices of musicians who go into the series. So just check out some different places, and you will know, especially by the names of the recording companies.
Thank you.
If I may add some more information for the people here. I'm an Israeli, as some of you may know, but actually I'm very active on the Polish scene. And so to answer your question about active Polish young jazz musicians, the number is estimated. I know Piotr will not agree to this, but it's about 5,000 at least. But the calculation can be very simply done. There are 13 music academies in Poland. Each academy releases every year about 30 to 40 new, I'm talking only about the jazz department, 40 new students with first degree, then all of them, most of them do a second degree, master's degree and a doctor's degree later on. So there are thousands of them. An average number of Polish jazz albums released every year is about 400, which is a staggering number. 400, I have all of them, each and every one of
really?
them.
I heard about 200. I didn't know that it's 400.
No, it's 400.
But I know you have all of them, so you must be right.
Well, there is a portal called Polish Jazz Blogspot.
Yeah.
If you want, you can contact me on my website or my Facebook if you want. On that, you can find all the Polish releases every year in the last 25 years. We also have a yearly poll of the best album, best musician, best blah, blah, blah.
I wrote it down on chat. You can check this out on chat.
Yeah,
I hope
I will write a few.
Yeah, I already did it. I think I didn't have any mistake.
Okay. Piotr is running his own record label, but there are actually about 50 independent Polish jazz labels active in Poland at the moment.
Not so active.
Well, some less active, some more active.
Yeah.
Some have 2 or 3 albums, some have a couple, well, about 100 albums a year. So it really depends, but it's a really, really big number. Polish jazz is Ma'asama in Hebrew, you know the word. It's really one of the most active scenes in the world. Other than let's say Germany and Scandinavia taking together, the same amount of activities are happening in Poland. Basically, if you drop on the Polish sky out from nowhere, you can have at least 1, perhaps 2 jazz festivals every day during the entire year. It's really bizarre, to be honest. I mean, it's a bit too much.
I think, Adam, you're a little bit exaggerating this.
Not really. In the summer, you have 3 to 4 festivals every day. Check out the Jazz Forum list. Yeah.
Okay. I will, because I don't know many of them. I don't know many of them, but I heard that there is around 150 like important jazz festivals in Poland.
Yeah, there are about 300 jazz festivals, but a lot of festivals, if they have a couple of concerts, they call themselves a festival, which is not fair. But a serious, there's at least 150 festivals that go on for 2 or 3 days at least. It's really worthwhile to check out Piotr's recording. He plays some really dusty trumpet, and it's really nice to hear his stuff. So you can go to his label. It's called SJ Records. And anyway, anybody who wants more info can, I'm not really active on the Israeli scene, but my website is the most visited website in the world for jazz with 11 million readers.
Exactly, that's true.
So
And thank you for
every
all those
Polish
reviews.
jazz album that
Adam,
is released is reviewed on my website, so you're welcome to read. Everything is there, just go there.
Adam
My
is a
website is
workaholic.
adambaruch.com, so you can be easier.
Yeah, I'll write it down. adambaruch.com. adambaruch.com. It's on chat right now. Adam is a workaholic. He listens to new jazz CDs every day, and every day after every listening, he writes a review, which are really masterpieces of this thing. You know, really great to read. So respect.
Guys,
Well, respect to you for an excellent lecture. Actually, much better than I expected, because I know you as a player, but not so much as a lecturer. Although we have, no, I did hear a few of your lectures before. Piotr mentioned his father. He comes from a well-rooted jazz family, and his father, who was a friend of mine, much older, of course, than Piotr, naturally, was a great person of great Polish grace and intelligence, and he wrote an excellent book about jazz history. Actually, it was in several volumes in the original
issue.
And we have spent a lot of time speaking about jazz before. So a good continuation of the Polish jazz tradition, Piotr. Congratulations.
Thank you.
His record labels.
Guys, I'm gonna have just one more question for Piotr before we leave. And before that, Sue asked over chat, is there a pure original Polish jazz today? Or if not, what influences Polish jazz today? The Black American style or the European?
Well, we cannot talk about pure jazz Polish style, because jazz is an American, mostly Black American jazz style. So we never can talk about pure jazz Polish style. It's never like this. But of course, we can either go into more American jazz or European jazz, or take some Polish folklore music and Polish music into jazz. So all of these three options are being done by Polish musicians in Poland. Some prefer to do more like Tomasz Stańko, ECM, European jazz. The others prefer like more American, which is usually more like this hot style, as I mentioned before. You know, they play amazing solos, a lot of chord changes and stuff like that. But it's more vivid, I would say, than the European style. And a lot of musicians, of course, right now, especially like 10 years before, they started to mix Polish folk music and basically Polish music with a lot of Polish classical composers into jazz. One of the first who started this trend was Zbigniew Namysłowski, but it was back a lot of years ago. But now it's quite actually popular stuff to do. Maybe because some subsidies are being given by the government for Polish jazz musicians who does that. So mix some Polish music, either folklore or classical with it. So it's some other factor. The other factor is, of course, being more original with its with the music that you play. If you take your own stuff, your own music that is typical for your country and put it into your jazz, you can export it worldwide, and it will be original. It will be really original, much more than trying to be another American or basically European style performer.
Guys, thank you so much. Wait, I'm gonna show myself. Thank you so much for coming, all the audience, and listening so carefully. especially for you, Piotr. Thank you so much for an amazing lecture, very
Thank you.
informative. I didn't ask you that, Piotr, but I'm sure that if someone has any further question, please forward it to me and I'll ask Piotr that after this lecture, and I'll give you an answer.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Somewhere.
You can also write to me via Facebook. On Facebook, you can find my email address, or on my webpage, you can find my email address. You can write me directly. So I'm easy to find. I'm easy to find. And sorry, I didn't hear Edith. So you can ask me some questions directly as well via email or Facebook or whatever. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Have a great evening. Tomorrow we're meeting again for the live broadcast, live streaming of One Quintet, directly from a new club, Yasmin, from Warsaw. See you at 8. It's going to be amazing. Bye, guys.
Thank you.